Hi, everyone. Welcome to the panel, Finding a Good Fit, Scaling Best Practices for Born Digital Material to Fit the Needs of Diverse Communities. Today, you'll be hearing from myself, Maggie Schreiner from the Center for Brooklyn History, from Margo Padilla from New York Historical Society, and from Siobhan Hagan from the DC Public Library. Following our three presentations, we'll take a few moments to reflect on some questions that touch on the topics we'll be discussing, and then we'll convene together in the Slack channel for a Q&A. Thank you. Hello, I'm Maggie Schreiner, recent manager of Archives and Special Collections at Brooklyn Historical Society. If you haven't heard, last month BHS formally merged with Brooklyn Public Library, creating the new Center for Brooklyn History. However, for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to stick with the BHS terminology, as I'll be speaking to the work, institutional structure, and constraints of BHS as an independent institution over the past few years. I also want to acknowledge my former colleagues at BHS who have made tremendous contributions to the projects I will be discussing: Julie May, John Zarillo, Tess Caldwell, and Erica Lopez. In 2016, BHS began the process of proactively stewarding our digital and born digital collections, with the goal of iteratively improving physical and intellectual control over these materials. At this point, the collections at BHS included a substantial amount of digitized material, approximately 15 terabytes, as well as born digital content ranging from materials on floppy disks and CDs to an external hard drive and computer tower. This was in a significant quantity of material given the small size of the institution. These materials had largely been managed passively and were at risk of data loss, corruption, or obsolescence. Our digital preservation program aimed to balance the need to responsibly steward the digital and born digital materials in our collections, be sustainable for our limited staffing and financial realities, and allow us to engage with and learn from our colleagues doing similar work at other institutions. In establishing our digital preservation and born digital records program, one of our main challenges has been scaling the recommendations and best practices, which thus far have been primarily articulated by large, well-funded research universities to fit our reality: a very small staff with limited funding and no in-house IT support. Like many organizations, collections funding at BHS has been deeply grant-driven, which has left little staff time or financial support for core mission activities, such as collections maintenance and digital asset management. Particularly, between 2015 and 2020, a period during which digital collections were rapidly expanding through major digitization projects and collections acquisitions, the financial pressures at BHS were also intensifying, which further increased the quantity and urgency of grant-driven work. While the extent of our funding constraints may have been somewhat unique to BHS, these pressures are widely faced across the field. As noted in the recent publication, What's Wrong with Digital Stewardship? Evaluating the Organization of Digital Preservation Programs from Practitioners' Perspectives, the authors note, a contingent support model fundamentally undermines and distracts from the ongoing maintenance that responsible digital stewardship requires. And the dearth of top-down support means that stewards must routinely campaign for material resources and decision-making authority. Constant advocacy takes a toll on practitioners. And this is something that we absolutely found to be true over the course of our project. The lack of in-house IT support also had a significant impact in moving forward with our digital preservation program. Our IT vendor had no experience with the unique needs of archives and special collections, and we had no dedicated staff person who had management of the vendor relationship as part of their articulated job responsibilities. Any in-house IT skills were incidental to staffers' primary responsibilities and were not considered in hiring or proactively developed. The impact of not having in-house IT or anywhere within the organization for digital strategy had impacts across our organization and dramatically impacted our ability to confidently steward our digital collections. Like many projects, our digital preservation program started with internal advocacy. In 2016, my colleagues formed a digital preservation committee to begin thinking strategically about stewarding our digital assets. The committee developed a digital preservation policy with the primary goal of using the document as an advocacy tool. Annual reviews with our senior leadership and trustees served as important moments for building an institutional understanding of the need for a digital preservation program and the financial and staffing commitments such a program would require. The Digital Preservation Committee also evaluated BHS practice according to the NDSA levels of digital preservation. Although the NDSA levels were aspirational and striving to achieve each element would have been highly unrealistic, the rubric was a useful starting place for assessment. And at this time, my colleague John Zarillo also conducted a collection survey to identify all born digital media physically held in the collections. The survey identified 332 media items across 51 collections, excluding our institutional archive. And this survey was really foundational for much of our future work and decisions, including equipment purchases and project design for addressing born digital records. In 2018, we decided to really dive into thinking about our born digital materials. We began this work with a monthly reading group. Some of the resources we consulted included SAA's Digital Preservation Essentials, the Society of American Archivists Electronic Records Section blog, and resources from OCLC and Digital Power. Much of this literature was written by and for large R1 universities and had very little that felt directly relevant to our context. For instance, Princeton's 2017 survey of born digital workstations, which is a hugely valuable resource for understanding the equipment landscape, focused on Princeton's peer institutions to inform their work. As the authors acknowledge, this makes the results of limited value to smaller organizations, which form the majority of collecting institutions. Additionally, staff at smaller institutions are much less likely to have the capacity or institutional support to undertake this type of research and scholarship. The result is a gap in the existing literature and publicly articulated best practices that are appropriate to small and under-resourced collecting institutions. Additionally, since none of us at BHS identified ourselves as experts, we didn't feel confident or empowered to move forward with our own adaptations to best practices that had previously been articulated by the field. A shift in our thinking occurred after I attended the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts 2018 conference, where Bonnie Weddle, the New York State Archives Electronic Records Coordinator, presented the talk, Born Digital Collections, Practical First Steps for Institutions. The presentation focused on iterative processes that can be implemented by smaller institutions. And it really empowered us to envision a BHS-sized program, which meant that we would start small and iterate when possible and in the ways that made sense for our staff and our collections. We first enacted this approach in our equipment decisions. We assembled a born digital processing workstation that consisted of an air-gapped desktop Dell computer and a set of external drives based on our known and anticipated needs. We assessed these needs using our existing inventory and for additional formats balanced the likelihood of acquiring those formats in the near future with the cost of the drives. We purchased a 3.5-inch floppy, CD, DVD, and zip drives, and memory card readers. Our most expensive piece of equipment was our write blocker, which based on our research seemed like the most important place to splurge. The total cost for our workstation was approximately $1,500, money that was carved out of our larger grant. We also found money in another grant to create a paid digital preservation fellowship, and we hired recent NYU MIAP graduate Erica Lopez for the position. I want to acknowledge that there's a very legitimate critique of using time-limited grant-funded positions broadly, and also specifically to move digital preservation work forward. For a small staff, particularly at an institution with extremely limited financial means, this was one of the few ways that we could channel resources towards this work. The fellowship framework was developed to allow lots of time for research, learning through trial and error, and experimentation. We also reached out to Bonnie Weddle from the New York State Archives, who generously agreed to answer our questions and review draft workflows, which gave us additional confidence moving forward. Starting from an existing inventory of legacy media in our collections, Erica created disk images for the majority of removable media. She also created appraisal reports for each collection, as we do not intend to keep the full disk image in the long term. And she conducted an overall assessment of our born digital holdings, including total file size, file formats represented, and collections including personal identifying information and more. She also created detailed workflows for using BitCurator, with the goals that these could be used by any processing staff at BHS in the future. Erica and I also reported out regularly to our colleagues through department presentations and our blog. A very positive result was an increased understanding of digital preservation and the unique needs of born digital materials, particularly among collection staff. This has expanded the base of advocates within the organization, as it is now understood as an essential component of collections management. Since the completion of Erica's fellowship, we have struggled to fully integrate the born digital processing workflows that Erica created into our overall departmental work. This is primarily due to significant staffing changes and layoffs in the intervening months and shifting priorities of collection staff, but it is also due to the inherent difficulties of integrating grant-funded work into holistic collections management. Given the constraints I mentioned earlier, what are the successful takeaways of this project? Getting started on the work by developing an aspirational digital preservation policy was a useful educational tool for the senior leadership of the institution. This allowed the collections team to start including funding lines for digital preservation within larger grant proposals. Although this is far from an ideal way to fund ongoing collections work, it successfully directed resources towards digital preservation for the first time. Erica put in the foundations of a Born Digital Records program, which we will build on as circumstances allow. We successfully found the resources, in our case, the New York State Archives, to support us in adapting and articulating best practice to fit our reality. And most important, we learned to embrace not being an expert and to start small. We are absolutely more equipped to responsibly steward the born digital materials in our collections after this project. Thank you. You can contact me at mschreiner@brooklynlibrary.org. That's mschreiner@BKLYN library.org, or on Twitter at Maggie Snare, MAGGIESNARE. Thank you again.
Hi, my name is Margo Padilla, and I'm the digital archivist at the New York Historical Society. I was hired in 2019 as part of a 5-year Leon Levy Foundation grant-funded project to create the infrastructure for collecting, processing, preserving, and making accessible born digital collections. Over the project period, I'll be using grant funds to build the Born Digital program, but I'll be phasing that into day-to-day operations, keeping in mind that there is no guarantee for a dedicated digital preservation budget or that a permanent digital archivist will be hired. So that means that I'll also be training permanent staff in digital archiving and digital preservation. So really the whole focus of my project is on scalability and flexibility. That is, applying best practices in a way that makes sense for where the institution is now, but that also addresses where we would like to go and is flexible enough to scale down if there is no dedicated funding, or scale up iteratively if there is. The New York Historical Society isn't starting from scratch by any means. We have a robust digitized collection available online, and we've been using Islandora as our digital repository. My focus is on born digital materials, specifically those coming to us from outside donors, our own institutional records for our institutional archives, and on legacy media that's currently held in the collection. And then I will be working to tie everything together into a cohesive system. So in order to know where to start, you have to know where you are now. I began by evaluating some of the current documentation, current workflows, and our current storage and backup systems. Some resources for helping evaluate where you are now are the National Digital Stewardship Alliance Levels of Digital Preservation and the Digital Preservation Coalition Rapid Assessment Model. Both of these do a great job of helping measure where you are now while also looking ahead to where you'd like to end up. The NDSA levels matrix is great because you can see at a glance good practice and best practice and the different roads that you might take. The NDSA site also has a template and guidance on how to use the levels as an assessment tool. So your institution might be at a level 1 in some areas and a level 4 in others, and you can see what it would take to get you to a level 4. But then again, a level 1, 2, or 3 might be perfectly suited to your institution's current priorities and resources. Not every best practice is best for every institution, and sometimes what we need to aim for is good practice. So once I had a sense of where the institution was in its current capabilities, I started to make a plan for how to get started. So I began by writing a straightforward digital preservation policies that establishes the minimum guidelines for how we would acquire and preserve born digital materials. And that's also so we can start advocating now to get that into a permanent budget line. So for example, the policy stipulates our levels of commitment for different types of digital materials, as well as our approach to things like copyrighted material or obsolete media. And it also delegates responsibilities amongst our staff, amongst curators, IT, processing archivists, and public service staff. We are very lucky to have IT support, but it is limited. So it's important for the work to be distributed now among staff and have that become integrated into the regular routines and responsibilities of permanent staff. I also wrote a deed of gift addendum specific to digital materials that addresses things like what we should do if we find personally identifiable information in the collection, or gather information from the donor about how they might allow us to provide access to their materials. I also wrote a donor intake form, and that's for the curators to give to the donors for us to acquire as much information as possible about the kinds of digital files that will be coming in before we actually undertake the acquisition. Just these 3 documents alone have already served us very well in bringing in newborn digital collections. But I think it's important to mention that I didn't write any of these from scratch. Our community is so great about sharing work that it's rare to have to reinvent the wheel. So what I did was I compiled a resource collection of each kind of document that I wanted to write. I read through them all, and then I pulled out parts that were relevant to our work, and then I added in anything that I felt was missing or wanted to specifically address at my institution. Here are some of the digital preservation policies that I referred to when writing my own. Most of these are incredibly thorough, which is fantastic, but it wasn't all applicable to my institution. So again, I read these keeping in mind our particular circumstances, our particular aspirations, and that minimum guidelines digital preservation policy can be expanded at any time, but we at least have that baseline. My next step was in selecting equipment and software for born digital acquisition, processing, and storage. I think sometimes when there's grant money available, it's really tempting to go out and buy what might seem like an out-of-the-box solution, or to buy that thing that you've been reading about that everybody says is the best thing. But then at the end of the grant period, you step back and you're staring at a CryoFlux and a Fred and probably wondering where you went wrong in life. Or you get that bill from the vendor and you realize that you can't pay it anymore. So I think it's easier to really start with the basics. And I went with a custom build, which I've listed out here. And this is very modular. You can swap things out. And it really is the basics that'll get you pretty far. The total cost for this setup was about $2,000, maybe just slightly over, but you can do it for even less. So you'll see we have our 2 workstations. I had IT upgrade an existing workstation to be used as a quarantine machine, and then purchased an additional machine for processing. We have some external storage, a 3.5-inch floppy drive, and then you'll also see materials on this list that we will likely purchase, but we may also determine that those won't ultimately serve our needs. All of the equipment, the auxiliary equipment, can be attached via USB, so it's not intimidating to use. And like I said, anything can be swapped out really easily. I think most importantly, all of this equipment is something that IT is already comfortable using, so we have 100% of their support on this. If it was a FRET or a CryoFlux situation, that would not be the case. We'd be on our own, and with limited staff expertise, that doesn't really make sense for us. So next was software, and as I mentioned, because I'll be training permanent staff in digital archiving who have only a little technical expertise, I wanted to make it easy to learn and as friendly and as intuitive as possible. So I went exclusively with open source and free tools that have a graphical user interface. The command line is powerful and it's certainly necessary for our work, but permanent staff isn't going to really get there. So GUIs are great. They have a low barrier and they're going to get us, 98% of the way there. So here are the tools that we're starting out with. We're using TerraCopy or Exactly for file transfers, BitCurator for capturing content off of digital media, ClamWin and Malwarebytes for our virus and malware scans, Data Accessioner and Data Accessioner Metadata Transformer for migrating files, and for creating and gathering metadata reports, especially the file manifest. bulk extractor viewer to scan for potentially sensitive information, bagger for creating our packages, and then we use archive space for description and management. And again, we use Islandora as our digital repository system. I have written a Born Digital accessioning manual that is a step-by-step guide for our processing archivists to use, and it walks them through using each piece of software and as well as how to attach the different pieces of equipment and things like that. The one thing that you can't include in a manual, of course, is the troubleshooting. So over the next couple of years, I'm really hoping to establish a comfort with not knowing, because no one is an expert in everything having to do with digital archiving. I think the #1 tool that digital archivists use is Google, followed maybe by YouTube. So I would really like to establish with permanent staff that not knowing is okay, and then how to research and dig around for the answer when they get stuck. Because if there is no plan to hire a permanent digital archivist and they are not comfortable with creative problem solving, a lot of this infrastructure will cease to exist. So I really want to let them know that we all get stuck and we all turn to each other for answers when that happens. So for now, these are the tools that we'll be using. It is very manual, but once we get comfortable using these and staff starts to grow in their capabilities, we can start looking into automation and into other products that will help us, such as Archivematica or another solution. For storage, IT purchased a dedicated storage appliance just for Born Digital and digitized collections. That's backed up nightly, and then it's backed up off-site to tape every few weeks. Additionally, we have everything backed up in the cloud in AWS. But being mindful not only of the financial implications of excessive long-term storage, but also the environmental toll, we have developed a tiered approach where resources are allocated according to the value and uniqueness of the materials being preserved. So for example, digitized materials with an available analog version will receive very limited redundant replication, whereas a unique, high-value Born Digital collection will receive geographically distributed, redundant bit-level replication. To provide access to our Born Digital collections, for now we will be providing researchers with a locked-down workstation in the reading room. So ahead of their visit, we'll load the collection files onto the machine, walk them through using the collection, and maybe include a tutorial on something like Quick View or ePad if it's necessary, and also ensure that we have installed and enabled any necessary assistive technology tools. We will also provide them with the file manifest that we get from Data Accessioner, and we'll also be adding that manifest from now on to our finding aids, so researchers will have instant access to that. A goal of ours is to eventually provide remote access for certain collections, and that's something that we're looking into now. So there are a ton of decisions to make when determining how to scale different approaches to your specific needs, but again, there is a lot of guidance out there. So for one, the digital processing framework, which suggests a minimum processing standard for digital archival content. And then something in that same vein that's more robust is the guidelines for efficient archival processing from the University of California. And that's excellent for helping make a number of decisions when it comes to appraisal, accessioning, and processing. And I also found it really easy to scale down their approach for application at my institution. Diagram is an interactive decision support tool that helps you prioritize how to manage and mitigate digital preservation risk based on your specific collections and on your available resources. Danning, the digital archival transfer or ingest or packaging group, it's pretty new, and they're trying to document the various considerations that archivists can use to determine whether or not it's appropriate to create or maintain a disk image. And they just recently released their first draft for community review, but it's already a really helpful resource. And last, I'll just mention the DLF Levels of Born Digital Access, which provides a set of baseline practices for providing access to Born Digital materials that are both scalable and actionable. The overall goals for our digital collections is that they are safe, that they're discoverable, and that they are accessible, and that our processes are sustainable over time. So I absolutely recommend reading up on best practices, but always keep in mind that, again, not all best practices are best for every institution, or maybe it's just not the best moment for best practices. Good practice good enough digital preservation, it will get you pretty far. And on its own, it's not a bad place to end up. Again, I think when working with grant funds, it's really tempting to go out and spend money on something that's flashy or complicated for your born digital setup, but it really doesn't have to be. And it certainly should not be if you are relying on grant funds or contingent labor. So establish what you can do at a minimum, be responsible about what kinds of collections you take in based on that minimum, and be great at it. Thank you very much. Please feel free to contact me with any questions or follow-up, and I'm always happy to share any of my documentation as well as links to any of the resources that I use. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Siobhan Hagan, and I am the Memory Lab Network Project Manager for DC Public Library. I'm happy to be with you here today virtually to discuss scaling digital preservation best practices for the public. In 2015, DC Public Library felt it was necessary to address the dire need of its community to have increased access and preservation skills for their personal archives. DCPL applied for and received funding for a National Digital Stewardship resident, and Jamie Mears was brought on to research and build a memory lab, which opened to the public in February of 2016. If you have heard about the memory lab, you probably have mostly heard that it's a place where anyone with a DC Public Library card can come in and transfer their personal archives on high quality equipment to digital files, and this is for free. But the memory lab space is much more than its physical space. Not only is a memory lab a public-facing digitization and transfer lab, as pictured here, but it's also an online resource. We have a LibGuide online that has step-by-step instructions on using the lab equipment, as well as additional resources on personal archiving and preservation. Lastly, we at DCPL define a memory lab as a series of ongoing programs related to all these topics. So we have classes on personal digital preservation, understanding and preserving your social media accounts, as well as regularly holding home movie days and screenings and other events that celebrate local communities, their history, and their memory. Our memory lab was a huge success. The lab opened in February of 2016, as I mentioned, so we just celebrated 4 years this past February. And the lab, it's important to note that it's been moved several times and it hasn't exactly been operating fully at maximum capacity those 4 years. But as of February of 2020, it's been used for over 4,800 hours by the public, with just over 590 members of the public transferring and preserving their own memories. Due to the success in 2017, we applied for and received an Institute of Museum and Library Services National Leadership Grant to bring the Memory Lab model to a total of 14 other public libraries across the country to form a network. You can see where each partner of the Memory Lab network are located by the blue pins on this map. The library partners each received training, mentoring, and financial support to create their own Memory Lab programs in their communities. We had 2 ambassadors from our first cohort of 7 library partners who came to Washington, DC in April 2018 for a week-long training. We threw them in the deep end with hours of lectures, amazing tours at Library of Congress and Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. And then we took our memory lab apart and made them put it back together again. As I mentioned, Jamie Mears was the original NDSR resident who built the memory lab at DCPL, and she built it with Lauren Algie, who worked at DCPL as a digital curation librarian. Both of them now work at the Library of Congress and are on the advisory board for the Memory Lab Network. And they've been integral to our success, especially for the in-person training. In January of this year, we did the in-person bootcamp training all over again and had 2 ambassadors from our second cohort of 7 library partners come to DC for several days and do the intensive training themselves. For the training of our library partner ambassadors, we took a training the trainer approach, since they're going to be going back to their libraries to train their staff and volunteers, who are then going to go and teach the public and answer questions also about digitization and digital preservation. In the trainings, we teach the concepts over teaching tools, since the concepts are the things that are going to stay the same, right? However, we still try and encourage them to try out and experiment tools for various concepts, because the public want to know, what do I use to get this done? And then we teach the best practices, of course, but we regularly communicate that best practices are not really feasible in a lot of instances, especially for personal digital archiving. And we regularly are focusing on what you can do, and doing something is better than doing nothing. While we focus on the concepts and really make sure that the trainers know, that they're going to have to keep an eye on finding new tools, since they're going to change over time, we really wanted to give them some practical experience. So we've come up with some tools to help them apply some of the concepts. And my main criteria for tools are that they're free, and then that they're very easy to use. So the first that's really important is any spreadsheet software. You got to use what you have already. If you use Google Spreadsheets and know how to use it, use that. If you have Excel and know how to enter info into that, then use that. And we just really want to point out that creating an inventory is an important part of the process and can't be skipped. So along those lines, the next tool, File List Creator, is actually this great free tool that can automate that process. So if someone's feeling really overwhelmed by how many, maybe thousands of digital files they have on a hard drive or computer, this tool will scan that drive and then will just spit out a bunch of metadata into a spreadsheet that then they can add information to, but that's a great way to start the inventory. Adobe Bridge can be used for batch renaming of files, and that's after, of course, we teach them all about why you want a great file naming convention and how to do that. Adobe Bridge can also do batch embedding of metadata into photos, but that gets very complicated pretty quickly, but we mentioned that is something you can do with that. There are several duplicate file finders that are free that we mentioned, and those can be used to just find either exactly duplicate files that then you can find where those are located and remove them if necessary, because we tell people that selection is such an important process and you can't preserve everything. So delete some things, especially duplicate files that you don't know exist. And then of course, similar photos. A lot of these tools show you similar photos. So if you have 1 million pictures you took of your dog that look exactly the same, you can go through and delete the ones, delete all of the extras and just save the ones that you really love, because not everything can be preserved. There are also smartphone apps I found that are free that can embed descriptive metadata into your photos. So those are really great to encourage folks if they're waiting in line for something or killing some time, they can open those apps and start adding some description to their photos on their phones. We expand the training that we initially give the network partners and ambassadors to hold monthly webinars to kind of build on the fundamentals that we've already talked about. So 2 webinars that we've had so far that we've tried to expand their understanding of digital preservation and best practices. We're going deeper into digital storage and then also software emulation. Both of these were taught by Ethan Gates, software preservation analyst for Yale Libraries. Thank you, Ethan, so much. In the near future, I'd love to hold webinars explaining more about fixity and migration. We've obviously covered those topics, but I just feel like they need a deep dive into those. So let me know if you're interested in helping out. We expect our library partners to take all this training we've provided them and then go and teach their communities. We do provide them with slide decks of classes that we teach at DCPL, and they can copy those and remix and reuse them to their liking. So, the webinars that I mentioned and all the training that we're trying to give them and the support and mentoring that I'm trying to give them is to help them to go not just teach their staff and then their communities, but also answer the really tough questions that they're inevitably going to get. You can see here examples from our partners. On the left, there are classes being taught in Pueblo City County, Colorado. In the middle, New Ulm, Minnesota. And then on the right, we have Central Arkansas Library System, who taught on YouTube some personal archiving classes in April when everything went virtual. So those are up on YouTube if you want to check those out. From the Memory Lab Network project, I've learned a lot about trying to scale digital preservation best practices for the public. And the most important thing, I think, to start with, especially, is to ask folks about their experience and their needs. and actively listen so that then you can meet them where they are and to really truly help them. Digital preservation is really scary to a lot of people. So it's important to break things down into simple steps and makes it a bit more digestible and take breaks. You know, people need time to process this information. Don't force too much too soon. But also encourage discomfort. I think that's really important. And the best way to do it is through solidarity. You're not alone. You're not lacking because you're not getting this. It's really hard. And, you know, we're here right with you and we're here to help you. So along those lines, while we're telling them, don't give up when it gets really hard, right? Keep going. It's also about letting go of perfection and therefore letting go of best practices, which can become really liberating. And I think it's necessary. All these things I just mentioned should help to build a safe space for people to learn. And the goal of that is to build their confidence. And building confidence will help them then scale up to take on a new challenge of digital preservation and to help them further their digital preservation strategy. Thank you so much for your attention and for your time. Please check out our website, memorylabnetwork.org, to learn more about our project, our partners, and our many, many, many resources that we're putting up there. You can find me on Twitter at these two handles. And then also you can please reach out to me at my email address, siobhan.hagan@dc.gov. I really look forward to
Now that we've heard about what best practice and good enough digital stewardship looks like at our 3 institutions, we wanted to take a few minutes for everyone to reflect privately about their own situations. And we've prepared 3 reflection questions to guide this portion of the presentation. What does good enough digital stewardship look like for your institution? What resources have been most useful for scaling best practice to fit your institutional needs? And how do you support your coworkers and other stakeholders to gain digital preservation skills? So if you could just take a couple minutes to reflect privately on these questions, and then we can head over to the Slack channel and continue the conversation there. Thank you again for joining us. If you haven't already, you can head over to the Slack channel and we'll continue the conversation there and answer any questions. Thank you again for joining us.